This is the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. This week, we're joined by Alex Edmans, Professor of Finance at the London Business School. In addition to his role at LBS, Alex is Managing Editor for the Review of Finance, a prominent TEDx speaker, and author of Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. We live in an environment where investors are looking for strong returns, while other stakeholders increasingly demand a slice of the pie. Successful businesses fuel our economy, but managing expectations for all stakeholders is a significant challenge for any company. Recent profit announcements from banks caused an outcry from those facing significant cost of living and mortgage rate increases. Yet Kiwis benefit from these profits through savings vehicles like KiwiSaver funds and the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. Is profit or purpose more important? How can society find a fair balance? At a time when good profits gets bad press, we discuss with Alex how businesses can deliver for both investors and society.
Welcome, Alex. It's really great to have you here, and we're really excited to talk about this meaty topic. Before we launch into your book, it would be great if you could provide our listeners with a bit of a background. How did you find yourself at the London Business School, and how did you find yourself thinking about the topics that you canvass in your book?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much for the invitation, Stefan and James. It's really good to be here. So I might go way back to what I studied at high school in England. So you actually have to specialise very early. So you can choose only 3 or 4 topics. And many of my friends did maths, physics, chemistry. Others did purely art subjects. So they did, say, English, history, German. So I did a mix of arts and sciences. So English, maths, economics and German. And so that's why I went into economics at university, is that on the one hand, you have some science, so there are some theories that's not purely subjective, but there's also differences of opinion. So it could be that we both look at the same theories, but maybe I advocate for higher taxes and you advocate for lower taxes. We can respect each other's opinion, but we just have different views. So I like that because it meant there would be a diversity of perspectives. So then I went into Morgan Stanley, working in investment banking. And that obviously, yes, people say there's trimmings of investment banking and it's a lucrative career, but genuinely, I found that really interesting. So it could be different bankers have different views as to whether a company should diversify or focus and so forth. And it was interesting working on that. But if I worked on that, I'd solve one company's problems at one time. Whereas with academic research, if you write a paper or a book, that might be timeless. So it might be something with a wider bandwidth. Say the link between purpose and profit, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, that's something that could apply to many companies in different industries and in different geographies, which is why we have this conversation from around the world right now. So I thought, let me move into academia because the bandwidth of your contribution could be higher rather than just a single company. And then finally, why ESG? So I worked at Morgan Stanley, which is an organisation where the financial rewards are so high. So you might think there's no need for anything like purpose. People will work hard to get promoted and to get the bonus. But what was surprising to me is that even in an industry where the extrinsic rewards were so great, actually purpose mattered. So what mattered was how your boss treated you, whether they gave you particular feedback of a meeting, even if you couldn't go, did they tell you how it went? Those smaller things mattered. So when I got to MIT and I studied my PhD, I wanted to look at what drove long-term value. And MIT being MIT, everybody else was looking at profits and dividends and cash flows, but I wanted to look at the intangible component, and that's what brought me to the work that I ended up doing.
Wow. Okay. And so then from there, obviously, you ultimately joined the university that you're at now, and have produced a range of papers and other things. How did you come to launching into Grow the Pie? How did that? What inspired that thinking?
Thanks. Well, let me tell you a little bit of the premise of the book, because then I will explain why I ended up wanting to write something about it. So, what is the pie to begin with? That is the amount of value that a company creates, and that can be divided between profits to investors and value to wider society, be that fair wages, fair prices, many of the things that you spoke about in the introduction. And often executives have a pie splitting mentality, that the pie is fixed And if so, the only way to make more profit is to extract as much as possible from wider society through higher prices or lower wages. And while companies may claim to pursue CSR, corporate social responsibility, if they have a fixed pie mindset, they never really have an incentive to put it into practice. Let's claim some nice things, but you're a fool if you give stuff to society because that's at the expense of profits. And so why I wanted to write the book called Grow the Pie is I wanted to highlight, no, it's actually in your interest as a company, if your goal is to generate long-term profits, to take seriously your impact on wider society. Why? Well, let's take employees as an example. If you pay them better, invest in them in skills development and meaningful work, they become more productive, more motivated, and in the end, companies end up being more profitable. And I think this is important because often when people think about the case for purpose or stakeholder capitalism, they're based on a moral and ethical case. And obviously morals and ethics are important, but number one, we might have different views as to what's moral and ethical. Maybe I prioritise climate change, maybe you care more about diversity and inclusion. And number two, at the end of the day, businesses do need to make money. So a moral and ethical case might seem to be a luxury. So when I come to this topic, I come as an ex-investment banker and as a finance professor, not a professor of philosophy. And I highlight, well, it's actually good business for a company to care about wider society. So I try to present the business and commercial case, and that's what the Grow the Pie idea is about.
Righto. And so I guess the backdrop to that is that, there's a lot of commentary out there saying that, capitalism is in crisis. It doesn't know what to do with itself now. And where do you think that comes from? And is it true?
Well, I certainly think it is true in terms of public perception. So if you ask the average man or woman on the street, they will argue that capitalism isn't working for wider society. And then what's their response to it? It will be to straitjacket capitalism with overregulation to split the pie back the other way. So their view is the only way that you can give more to society is if you reduce profits to investors. But exactly as you said at the start, Stefan, who do profits go to? They don't go to nameless, faceless capitalists. They go to the citizens through NZ Super, or they go through to people through their pension fund and so on. So the idea that it's either them or us, not only is that practiced by some executives who try to make profits by exploiting society, it's also advocated by some advocates of business reform who think straitjacking and over-regulating business is the only way to get it to work for others. So what I want to highlight is a collaborative approach where is there a way that we can harness business to create shared value for both shareholders and society? And while you might think, well, this idea of win-wins might be wishful thinking, it might be too good to be true, the heartbeat of the book is rigorous evidence suggesting that it is possible to generate both financial and social returns in the long term.
Who's harder to convince, Alex? Is it the shareholders or is it sort of society in general in terms of growing the pie rather than re-splitting it out depending on what side of the, I guess, pie you sit on?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, James. Both are difficult. Well, both are difficult and both are easy on one sense. So with executives, what I try to do is I couch it by saying, this is not inconsistent with all the other things that has made your company successful. So let's take an investment bank, which you might think might not be particularly attuned to the idea of purpose. Well, investment banks claim that the way they're successful is by being trusted advisors to their clients. They will decide not to do a deal if they think it's not in the client's interest, and they claim to mentor and nurture junior talent. And indeed, at Morgan Stanley, many of the senior bankers were homegrown who started as analysts. And so they'd always been about long-term thinking. And so the idea of grow the pie, when I put it in that language, is something that they will resonate with. So some of the nicest comments I get, if I go to an away day or an offsite at a conference, I give a talk, and then at the end there's a drinks reception. If somebody's had a bit too many drinks, they come up to me and say, I really was not looking forward to your session. I thought the idea of purpose was just woke and fluffy, particularly as a professor, you might not have any knowledge of commercial reality, but you highlighted that this is fully consistent with commercial thinking. So I think they might be initially reticent, but when you come to them with data and evidence, rather than guilt tripping, then actually they are much more receptive. So actually then surprisingly, I think it might be the person on the street which is more difficult to convince, because they might have deep-seated views that capitalism is untrustworthy. And some of my other work, and you mentioned my TED Talks, that's on confirmation bias, that if you have an existing view of the world, no matter how good the evidence is, if it's something you disagree with, you're just not going to be open to it. And so there are many people, which might be for good reason, they might have had a personal experience at a company, that they have a lot of mistrust in business, and it's actually more difficult to convince those people because data and evidence won't work so well.
That confirmation bias is often the thing that leads to things like, without getting political, Brexit and Trump mania and those sorts of things, where you have a particular view despite the evidence going the other way. Is that been something that, I guess, confirms some of your research in those sort of big events that have been happening globally, perhaps, or it feels like more than normal? Whether that's the case, I'm not sure.
Absolutely, James. So this was the TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World. I indeed spoke about Brexit there. So there was a claim made on the side of a bus that the UK spends £350 million to the EU, when the number was 250, and then when you subtract all the stuff that the UK gets back, it was far, far less than that, something about 100 million, I think. So this was orders of magnitude off. And then when the new data came out showing that this is wrong, people said, oh no, well, this was not a big driver of our decision anyway. So you might make a decision based on something, and then if that information is found to be false, then you sort of shift your view and claim, well, that was not the major driver. So you twist information to either claim it was irrelevant or claim that a study shows X when it actually shows Y. We see this in things like Brexit or just general politics, and therefore it's not surprising that we see this in corporate life as well. And again, from both sides. So there are ESG advocates where if there's somebody who expresses some skepticism, you've seen this particularly in the US, they might claim, well, you must be a climate change denier, when actually we want to have healthy discussion. Actually, ESG is not the only thing that drives company value. We also need to care about productivity and innovation and capital allocation. And then similarly, if somebody's an ESG skeptic, then when they read anything by an ESG advocate, they think this person must be a woke hippie who doesn't understand commercial realities. So another thing that I try to promote, in not only but with my other writings, is just a grown-up, respectful discussion about these issues, which then goes back to my background, why I like to do economics to begin with. I was studying high school economics at the time that the single currency was being formed, and there were debates as to whether this was a good or bad thing. The UK was granting central bank independence, and again, we can have a respectful discussion as to whether the central bank could be independent. I might end up disagreeing with you, but through speaking with you, I actually have a much more informed view about this than if I was just to be in an echo chamber.
Well, it's often easier to change the narrative to be wrong than to be wrong at a personal level, and it's probably rational to change the narrative than be wrong at a political level. So as painful as it is to watch some of these things unfold, you can kind of understand how it does happen, and people haven't changed through the generations. We're all the same as we were 200, 500,000 years ago. Milton Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times in the 1970s that said the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. Now, this is obviously not a neat fit with what you're saying at all. How when you hear that, what do you think, and how wrong is he?
I actually think that he was more right than many people, particularly ESG people like me, like to give him credit for. So that might seem a bizarre thing for me to say. Shouldn't I be the enemy of Friedman? It's always that in order to get accepted into polite society nowadays, you need to fall over yourself to say how much you disagree with Friedman. And so on the face of it, the idea the social responsibility of business is to increase profit, that just sounds offensive, right? What he suggests is that companies should mistreat their workers, pollute their environment in order to pursue profits. But actually, if you read the article beyond the title, he's much more nuanced than people give him credit for. So he highlights in particular long-term profits. And I think if he put long-term in the title, then people would have a much less polarized view as to his idea. So why does he argue that a company should only pursue long-term profits? Well, in order to pursue long-term profits, you need to care about society. Right? You can't mistreat your workers or they'll leave. If you pollute the environment, the brand will be hurt. And by pursuing long-term profits, you will make investments in things that society wants. Right? So what would a car company do that cares about long-term profits? They would invest in electric cars rather than taking the easy option of just continuing to run traditional cars. So I think there is quite a lot in the Friedman idea. But why I still disagree with him is two things. Number one is even in the long term, there might be certain things you do to affect society which don't show up in long-term profits. These are known as externalities. So in the absence of a fair carbon tax or carbon price, it could be I can just pollute and I won't suffer the consequences. And number two, and this is more novel to my work and my research, is that it's very difficult to maximize long-term profits in an instrumental way. So does an executive go into the office each day and think, how can I maximize long-term profits? Or do I think about, well, how can I deliver value to my clients and my employees and so on? For example, if you were to think about, should your firm give employees more parental leave? What Friedman would argue is calculate. But if I give more parental leave, this many workers will be more productive, they're going to make this much more money for me, and let me compare that to the cost of parental leave. But there's no way that you can do such a calculation from an instrumental perspective. You just can't put even rough numbers on that. Whereas a purposeful approach or a pie-growing approach is how can I deliver value to my employees? That might lead to me granting parental leave. And then in the end, these employees do become more motivated, more productive. And so in the end, in fact, I get benefits that exceed the costs. But because I could not have predicted that from the outset, that was something that a pure Friedman approach would not have advocated, and actually I would have been less successful under his approach.
It's one of the issues with a lot of your work, Alex, is the measurability of it. And I'm not saying you can't measure it, but for naysayers, they're always going to go, yeah, but how do you measure productivity if you give them more parental leave or something like that? How do you solve for that issue? Because I can, on the face of it, if an employer has greater benefits, you attract perhaps better employees because they want to work for you, and perhaps you get greater productivity while they're there. Is there a way to measure that that you found for some of your stakeholders that have, I guess, proven some of this?
Certainly, and so measurement is a really tricky issue. I think many of these things, the benefits of greater productivity and motivation and retention, are hard to measure, particularly in the short term. But in the long term, you can measure it. And so a lot of the work that I do looks at long-term stock returns. So why is that good? Well, in the short term, maybe these things are costly, but in the long term, the greater productivity, motivation, retention will manifest. And also, when you look at long-term stock returns, you can do many things in order to try to disentangle correlation from causation. For example, if, say, companies with high employee satisfaction did better, you might wonder, well, is this employee satisfaction, or is this something else? Maybe tech companies tend to have higher employee satisfaction because the work is more fun than, say, coal mining. And also the tech industry has just done really well. But in the long term, what you can do is you can control for the performance of the tech sector. You can control for a lot of other variables. So you can certainly see in the long term what the consequences are of these societal actions. But the one caveat I will say is that when people think about measurement, they think, well, measurement will be the panacea. So if we could just measure these ESG/sustainability factors, then companies will pay more attention because what gets measured gets done. But while I believe you can measure the output, the effect of sustainability, long-term stock returns, I don't really believe that you can measure the input, which is how sustainable you are. So let's take, for example, diversity and inclusion. Some people will measure this by looking at the percentage of minorities on the board, either ethnic or gender, when actually diversity and inclusion includes many things further than this, such as the corporate culture, which allows people to speak up and embraces different viewpoints and so on. Cognitive diversity is far beyond demographic diversity. So if you took a measurement approach to something as rich and complex and nuanced as diversity and inclusion, you can get many people which end up ticking the box. So a company could care not at all about D&I, but put some minorities on the board to tick a box. So long story short, while you can measure the consequences of sustainable behaviour in the long-term stock price, it's difficult to measure sustainable behaviour right now. And so this is why I think if a company wants to pursue the pie growing approach, do this sort of genuinely, do it intrinsically because you believe diversity and inclusion matters, not because you can report it and then tick particular boxes or improve your diversity ratings.
You just, in another context, you went on to say, in relation to the Milford Friedman point, which and this one is, profits are important, but profits are an outcome, not a goal. And so, if I understand you correctly, you're saying, well, you should pursue the things whether or not you know that it's going to translate to profits down the line, if you genuinely believe that it's for the betterment of the business and customers and stakeholders. Is that what you're trying to capture with that sentence?
Yes, absolutely. So you can think about this in other contexts. So let's say, what is the meaning of life? So if you thought the meaning of life was happiness, is that something that you pursue directly? If I tried to pursue happiness directly, I probably would engage in hedonistic behaviour and eating and drinking without limit, for example. That would be what I do to pursue happiness. But if I pursue happiness as an outcome, not as the ultimate objective, I might live a life where I'm going to treat my family well and my colleagues well and be a good citizen. And as a byproduct of that, I probably would become happier than if I pursued happiness directly. And so I think that's the same with profits. If your mindset is, I will only take this decision if it's going to lead to profits, then some decisions I would get right. So the decisions where you can back this up with a spreadsheet calculation, do I make a large or a smaller factory? I can calculate the cost of the greater capacity and trade that off against the greater productive output. But for many decisions, particularly in 2022, where there are intangible factors like that matter, what is the effect of me being even more transparent to my customers about the funds that I run and the fees? Can I predict that greater transparency will lead to this many more funds going in? I probably can't. So if I do it because I think it's the right thing to do, and then view profits as an outcome of doing that, then it might lead me to take more trust-building actions than I would have done otherwise, and then I may end up being more successful than I would have done had I viewed profits as the end goal rather than just a byproduct or an outcome.
There's lots of different ways that people sort of frame this approach and the delivery of value to society, which is kind of, it's all intertwined at one level. One perspective is the term stakeholder capitalism, which I think is you spend a lot of time sort of focused on. Another is enlightened shareholder value, CSR, and then you've got pie economics. Would you mind unpacking the differences between them?
Absolutely. So I'll first start with enlightened shareholder value. And that is, I think, the idea of Friedman, which is as long as you're enlightened and you understand that many things that you do to serve society will ultimately lead through to long-term profits, then there's actually nothing wrong with pursuing long-term profits because that will force you to care about society. So we've just discussed earlier how there's some truth to that, but it's not the whole truth. Now, CSR, or corporate social responsibility, this is the idea that we do some good things to boost our image. But CSR is often seen as an ancillary activity which is not linked to the core business. So it might involve donating lots of money to charity. So it could be you're a tobacco company where your core product doesn't actually create value for society, but rather than reducing the addictiveness of your products or rather than reducing the aggressiveness of your advertising, you donate millions of dollars to whatever happens to be the issue of the day. Let's say give it to Black Lives Matter after George Floyd's murder, and that's something where you believe you're creating value. Whereas for me, growing the pie or pieconomics is about the core business. The final thing, which is the we mentioned at the start, was stakeholder capitalism, and that's about trying to create as much value as possible for wider society, but it often forgets about shareholders. And I think that's a mistake for two main reasons, I think both of which we've discussed, alluded to earlier. First, if you don't highlight the importance of profits, if you just look at serving wider society, then no CEO is going to truly embrace stakeholder capitalism. You'll sign some nice statements, but you'll release some nice slogans, but you're not genuinely going to embrace anything, which is not going to improve the company's commercial success down the line. And the second is if a company's not generating long-term returns, then it's not giving returns to its investors, be they a national wealth fund or be they a pension fund. So the idea of economics is that it tries to be, I think, a common ground between enlightened shareholder value and stakeholder capitalism. Are there ways of creating value for wider society, but also in a way that improves our long-term returns to investors?
How you obviously you focus on growing the pie, but a lot of people argue that growth is finite and you can't just keep growing and growing and growing. How do you respond to that?
So I think that's because people have a narrow view of growth. So certainly if growth was GDP growth, yes, there is a finite amount to which you grow without exceeding planetary boundaries. But I define growth and I define the pie as social value. So financial wealth, or GDP, that's only one slice. Like, what are other parts of social value? One is human capital. Well, how can you grow human capital? By providing employees with a healthy and enriching workplace, with good work-life balance, with mentorship, with a psychologically safe corporate culture. And that is something where there's not planetary boundaries or resource constraints in how much we can invest in our workers and develop human capital. This might also involve natural capital, or some people call it environmental capital. Well, how can you grow environmental capital? By coming up with new ways that reduce the resource usage in production, new ways to work, such as what we're doing right now on video conference rather than in person. Are there other innovations that might involve other sources of power and energy? And I think that is something which, again, rather than coming up against planetary boundaries, it actually loosens those planetary boundaries. You can have innovation capital and many other forms of capital and so on. But I think it's really important to realise that we do want to pursue growth, not status quo and stagnation. So many people who subscribe to degrowth economics argues that companies should not innovate. They should just stay where they are because anything a company does more, it's going to do more harm. But actually, for me, what really matters is errors of omission, not errors of commission. Right? If a company fails to innovate, fails to train its employees, fails to come up with a new way of rearranging production to use fewer resources, then the amount of value destruction to society could be way, way higher. So as long as you view growth as creating social value, not making money, but viewing money as a byproduct, profits being an outcome, then I do think it's useful to have this growth mindset rather than just this fixed mindset.
Alex, how do you think we're going in terms of you started off in investment banking, which is probably the polar opposite in terms of, like you said at the start at least, of what the goals are there. There's quite, or at least from the outset, a unique driver, which is profitability. And now you've done many years of research into what you've just been discussing. Have you sort of taken a step back and gone, how society progressed in this, and have we progressed? And I guess the question really is, are you an optimist? Are we doing okay despite all the rhetoric about the world's crashing and there's a lot of negativity out there? Perhaps we're all sort of still suffering from the hangover of COVID, but how do you think we are placed in the world at the moment following your research?
I think the glass is both half full and half empty. So let me start with the half full idea, is that I do think that the idea of ESG and sustainability has become mainstream. So when I went to my first responsible investing conference in 2007, so 15 years ago, if I was to mention the investors who were there, you probably wouldn't have heard of most of them because they were very niche players. Only if you had a specific ESG mandate would you care about these factors. Well, nowadays, it's mainstream. So the likes of BlackRock and Fidelity will at least claim to care about responsible investing. And why? Not just because it's going to create value for wider society, but they believe from a purely financial perspective, this is something that we need to incorporate into our investment analysis. So I've been serving on the Responsible Investment Advisory Committee for Royal London Asset Management for the last 7 years. We have £12 billion in sustainable funds. Yet who comes to our meetings? It's not just the head of sustainable investment, but the chief investment officer. So he's responsible for every fund, including many funds without a sustainable label. But he realizes that these are factors which affect long-term returns. And so this should be relevant for any fund, even the funds without sustainability in their name. And you can see this also with companies. It's not just the CSR department which talks about purpose. Often it's the CEO or chair or CFO speaking about this. But then when I go to the glass half empty, I think the pendulum has swung too far the other way. In that before people didn't care about ESG enough. Now they care about it too much. And you might think, well, that's crazy. How can an ESG advocate say there's too much of it? But now people view ESG, they put it on a pedestal compared to other drivers of long-term value, such as innovation, productivity, capital allocation, and so on. So why do we care about ESG? It improves both financial and social value. But if a company's just really innovative, or great at allocating capital, or you have a great leadership team, or you're resilient or adaptable, all of those things help the company's long-term success and will also help wider society because obviously innovations have a big spillover. But if you're an investor and you engage with the company by having a vote on, let's say, the use of plastic packaging or electromagnetic radiation, you will get far more brownie points than if you engaged on something like capital allocation, at least within some fields. There are some countries in which people sort of will give you far more credit in engaging on ESG. And similarly, if you're a company and you donate loads of money to a charity, that might improve your standing in wider society more than making great products. So I think we need to recognise that ESG is useful, but other long-term intangible assets are also useful. And the most recent paper I wrote has a controversial title called The End of ESG. And you might think, well, that's crazy, that the ESG advocate should say ESG should be no more. But why I call it that is for two reasons. First, I don't think ESG should be a niche term anymore. It should be something that everybody understands the value of. And so that was my glass half full point, that even a mainstream chief investment officer should care about ESG. But second, ESG should not be put on a pedestal compared to other factors that drive long-term value. Right now, as I mentioned, an investor or a company that improves its ESG will get better coverage and sort of more brownie points than if it was to improve its performance on other long-term value relevant dimensions.
What's the feedback when you, I guess, present those sorts of presentations at a forum when you go, when using the topic ESG is coming to an end, ESG is dead? I know it's sort of, you're trying to be controversial, but do you see the people that you deal with and the businesses that you work with having the same view? Do they think it's sort of taking up too much of their driver in their decision making, or do you see a lot of your people that you talk to still not doing enough, and it's perhaps the hype up of the media and things like that is making ESG such a I guess overly influential?
Yeah, so this end of ESG paper has been by far the fastest downloaded paper that I've ever written. So it's all academics posts from the Social Science Research Network, and this was number 3 in downloads, and across all fields, so not just social sciences, but physical sciences, history, humanities, and so on. So this was like really surprising. And why? I think it was something that everybody ended up rallying around. So for the ESG skeptics, they liked the fact that it highlighted that ESG should not be put on a pedestal. And for the ESG advocates, they highlighted that ESG should be mainstream and we should not be considered as a small part of the organisation. So I think whenever I speak, the main concern, the main challenge I have is not so much pushback, but lack of push forward. And what do I mean by this? So if I was an ESG advocate who wrote a book or gave a talk saying companies are completely evil, right, let's just forget about profits, the only goal of a company should be to address climate change and provide workers with maximum wages and so on, then there would be some pressure groups who would just applaud me and push this really forward, because that is something where if you focus on, say, single issues, then this is something which gets a lot of play. When I highlight the importance of trade-offs and, well, we actually need to consider about many slices of the pie, not just yours, then that doesn't get as much push forward as something which is one-sided. But again, it sort of depends on your objective, is that I think in order to come up with ideas that people are willing to implement, they need to consider many different parties. So what's been gratifying is that shortly after the book came out, I know that many asset managers told me they'd sent their book to CEOs of companies they invest in, and they said, well, tell me how you are implementing the principles, or explain to me why we're not. Others said, well, we're having actually regular meetings in our investment team to discuss how we're integrating this into the investment strategy. And I think you would only have writings that do get implemented if people realise that there is some commercial sense behind this rather than just doing good for the world, because the latter is obviously really important, but at the end of the day, businesses are not charities. They need to generate returns for investors, and investment funds, they need to generate returns for their ultimate clients.
With businesses that would find it harder to identify their purpose, I don't know, suppose you work for BP or an oil mining business, or say, in fracking or something like that. How do you explain to employees or to management and, I guess challenged industries, we'll call them that, to describe their purpose? Because I would expect that employees would go, well, it's wokeism or it's twee or something like that, and you could have the opposite effect where you end up with a backlash versus at least you've got a clear goal.
Yeah, so my view of purpose and sort of good or controversial versus green industries is quite nuanced and not very black and white. So what I try to look at is the net benefit that you create for wider society. And sort of right now, and this might be controversial, some of your listeners might not agree, I do think BP provides a net benefit, because right now we don't have enough renewable energy to power all of the world's needs, and in particular to power the development of developing countries. I believe that BP purpose is to move towards renewable energy, and I do think that BP, in particular compared to many of its peers, is one of the leaders of trying to lead this transition. But that being said, if you were an employee working on, let's say, some of the legacy assets of BP, they still have a value today. And sort of the Russia-Ukraine war has highlighted the importance of having a stable energy supply which is affordable, which, particularly for low-income households, this is something which is a large part of their bucket. And you can also apply that to many other types of industries. So defence, before the war, was viewed as something sort of that a responsible investor should not touch. At Royal London, we were never excluding of defence, because sadly, in the modern world, a country does need to defend itself. In an ideal world, you wouldn't, but the world is not ideal. You will have the possibility of attacks by other people. Now, there are some industries that we do have a blanket exclusion on, like tobacco. And to me, I do think it's quite challenging to have a purpose there. So one of the UK tobacco companies, their purpose statement is to offer something better to the world's smokers. So that sort of assumes smokers are out there, and then we're going to offer them something better. But smokers are not just out there, you've caused them by advertising and so on. So I don't think I would not treat them the same as to offer something better to somebody with a particular illness, where that illness was something that was not the company wasn't a contributor towards. So I think that while I would not exclude many industries, that is an industry that not only I, but also Royal London does have an exclusion on.
Are there other examples of that, Alex? Other exclusions that you think about in that way? I think for New Zealand's, we've got this sort of interesting dilemma with nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, where there was a famous speech in the 80s that have meant we've been nuclear free since. But on the other hand, look what that would do if nuclear energy became the norm in terms of fossil fuel output with, electricity generation. I guess it's a constantly a moving feast. But do you think there'll be many industries that you'd look to exclude over time, or do you think it's actually very few that you would do?
I think it's few, because when you think about if you have an exclusion on an industry, then that basically says the world will be better off if that industry just did not exist. And I would say that about tobacco, even though I'm mindful that the industry does provide many jobs to people. We also have a blanket exclusion on controversial weapons, where there's various UN protocols which defines what's controversial, so things like cluster munitions and so on. We do not have an exclusion on alcohol. So there might be some investors who will say, well, actually, alcohol does cause harm, and obviously there are issues like violence and so on, which comes from that. But do I think the world will be better off with no alcohol? I don't. I think that it's in a world which is increasingly fragmented. It brings people together. It's a social lubricant. If we didn't have some events where alcohol is there, I think that has a positive benefit. So we would look for a company to be best in class in terms of its development of responsible drinking, low alcohol beers, how they're advertising themselves, and so on. So I think many people wouldn't like to live in a world in which there was blanket prohibition. And so if you don't have an exclusion, that would at least allow you to invest in a best-in-class industry, even if you ended up down-weighting the industry, because clearly that industry does not have as much positive benefit as, say, financial services or pharmaceuticals.
Do you just stepping back a bit further again, do you think that regulation has a role to play in changing the mindset of the profit focus versus purpose focus? How do the two sit together?
Yeah. So I think regulation does have a role, but also regulators need to be very careful as to what their role is. So the role, I think, should be quite specific. So a lot of the problems we see in the world are market failure. So what is a market failure? That's when we have the externality that I referred to earlier. That's when you have an impact on wider society, which you do not bear the consequences of. And why can the government address that? Well, they have a great scheme, which is taxes or a blanket prohibition. So you can blanket prohibit something like child labour. And then you can put taxes on issues such as carbon. So I think if there was a global carbon tax, then that would address a lot of these issues. You currently have taxes on alcohol and tobacco, which will try to internalise that externality. But I think when the government tries to regulate other issues, then that might be more difficult because it's not clear what the market failure is. So, for example, in the US, NASDAQ, which is the one of the exchanges, tried to ban companies from going public unless they have a diverse director. But it's not clear why there's a market failure, even though I would benefit from such a regulation because they have ethnic minorities there. Where is the market failure? Because if diversity indeed led to better decisions, well, then a company feels all of the consequences of that. There was no regulation for football teams to have black players, but football teams realised that actually, the first teams to realise that actually black players are excellent, despite growing up in a world in which maybe there's far less racial fairness. The first companies to do that got a big comparative advantage. And so it's not clear why the government should intervene in something where it's in the company's long-term interest in the end. And also there's many other dimensions of diversity, as we've spoken about, other than just racial or gender diversity. And so if the government regulates it, then it could be that you exclude a white male who would have provided a lot of socioeconomic diversity.
It's funny that your comments, Alex, because in the end, regulation happens when there's market failure, or regulation should happen when there's market failure. And that's, I guess, that's my belief system anyway. And there's lots of market failures and the government should intervene, whether it's monopolistic behavior or whatever it is. I guess, though, that's an easy statement to say because it comes down to what your definition of market failure is. Because I guess some people would think that having a board with a whole lot of white males is market failure, and others would say that the market will decide the correct people to make the best decisions for that company. And where do you think there needs to be influence? There are countries that have requirements around board members, and there are others that don't. Do you think there is a market failure around some of these? And it's not just gender and racial diversity on boards. A lot of businesses talk about some of these market failures and whether there should be sort of influence from government. Do you have a view on those?
Yeah, so the good thing about market failure is that there's a very clear economic definition of market failure, which is where the competitive outcome is not going to lead to the social value maximizing outcome. And that can happen if there's externalities, that can happen if there's monopoly rather than free and fair competition. So those are certainly two things where the government should intervene. However, let's think about diversity. And again, I say this, the listeners might not know this, but I'm an ethnic minority, so I would benefit from regulation on diversity. But first, look at the evidence. The evidence that actual diversity improves long-term value is either mixed or negative. Now, people don't like this. The confirmation bias means that they won't accept it. But if you look at the evidence, this is what it shows. Now, London Business School, which is my employer, so it gives me no joy to say this, they did a report for the UK regulator where they ran 90 different tests on the link between diversity and performance. 0 was significant, yet they claimed in the executive summary, we have found a positive relationship. So they basically lied about the results. The Dean of London Business School said, we all stand to learn from the author's methodology and their rigour, when we don't learn for something where you're just fraudulent about the results. But again, due to confirmation bias, if you have a headline, diversity leads to better performance, then people will not bother to look at the 90 tables. They're just going to believe the headline results. So there was a great paper by Jesse Fried, a Harvard law professor, called Will Nasdaq's Diversity Rule Harm Investors, where he looked at all the scientific research on diversity. Many papers were conducted by ethnic minorities or women, so it's not that they had a bias towards this, and they're finding actually, if you look at the evidence and look at things like correlation and causation, it's either mixed or negative. Now, it could be that you view diversity as important for some non-financial reasons. So it could be that you think, I don't really care about the effect of performance, but I just think for social reasons that we want to have more diversity here because of an externality. And that would be a market failure, because if companies would have the profit maximizing outcome, that would not be to have a diverse board if indeed diversity did not improve firm value. But that's not the argument that people are making. So I view that there's sort of cognitive dissonance and doublethink. So on the one hand, people say, diversity clearly pays off. Look at all these McKinsey studies that claim that. But if so, you don't need regulation. Otherwise, why didn't you regulate that company gives training to its employees? Why don't you regulate that investment decisions are good and you're not going to be investing in sort of bad projects? That's things where if you make bad decisions, then you will be weeded out. So regulation is only really needed if it's not in your interest in the long term for you to take that decision. But that's different from the people who claim that diversity will always pays off. So there's some inconsistency there.
What was the outcome of that London Business School paper? Was there outcry, or was it something that was more swept under the carpet and it's easier to talk about now? What was the reaction to the headline versus the actual outcome of the study?
Yeah, so people did try to sweep it under the carpet. So when it came out, people wrote to me and saying, "Oh, Alex, you've got an issue here with this particular article." And then I read it very carefully, and I would have loved to believe the result. Right? I would have loved to believe diversity pays off, and I would love to believe that my organisation was the one showing this research. But I found this was not the case. And also London Business School was heavily promoting it, and claiming they had causal evidence of this. And so I wrote an op-ed with one of the major newspapers in the UK just saying, actually, this is not true based on the data, yet this is not a reason not to have diversity initiatives. For example, it could well be that you think the social reasons for diversity are so important that it doesn't matter whether there's a financial case, right? When I choose to buy organic meat, I don't do this for any financial reason. I do this because I have other non-financial objectives. So you can be honest and say, okay, there's no link to superior performance, but just do this anyway. When I became the managing editor of the Review of Finance, which you mentioned at the start, I elected the first female editors to our on our board in our 21-year history. This was not based on any evidence that female editors improve the impact factor of academic journals. This is just something I thought was the right thing to do, and I wanted to work in an editorial board that had a diversity of views and diversity in terms of gender, irrespective of the evidence. So I think if the evidence is not there, you can still say, we're going to take these decisions. And I think, why is this so important? There's so many other dimensions of diversity and inclusion where there is no McKinsey study showing that inclusion of disabled people improves financial performance. So does this mean that companies should not care about inclusion of disabilities? No. But I think if we get addicted to doing things only because there's studies showing it leads to long-term performance, then you go back to the Friedmanism, the instrumental methodology that I highlighted earlier. So I think people did sort of try to sweep things under the carpet and sort of once my op-ed came out, they stopped trumpeting it. What I would have liked is people to have issued a retraction to this and said, actually, this is not a correct study. And this is what happens in scientific journals if a study comes out which is later found to be wrong. This study was never even peer reviewed to begin with, but people latched on it without seeing whether it had been vetted, and they haven't retracted it. So this is still out there in the public domain, and people are still making decisions based on fraudulent evidence.
I would have loved to have been in your office when you were reading it, because it's so disappointing when you have, because when you look at it specifically, it's not all about financial outcomes, like you say, it's about social outcomes too. And if it was premised in that way, it would have been a really positive outcome. But it probably undoes a lot of the hard work you've been doing over years when you read things like that aren't even peer reviewed, without trying to beat up your employer too much.
I think so, and I think this is why there is a backlash too against ESG. So there is the anti-ESG movement, which many people, particularly in the US, are behind. And I do have some sympathy for them, because when you see a pro-ESG study and it is not based on rigorous research, if you think, well, people are trying to pull the wool over your eyes, then that I don't think is fair. And so I do think that the reason why there is some of this backlash is partly deserved by making some claims which are not backed up by the data. And then to respond to some of this backlash and say, you must be a climate change denier, or you must be a Republican corrupted by political donations, I think is not correct, not fair. And what is surprising to me is that many academics have made such assertions. So there's one leading academic who called people who express skepticism Taliban and flat earthers. And I think this is really unfair to call somebody Taliban. This is just borderline unprofessional, when as an academic, you should be about promoting healthy discourse and respect for other people's opinions. Even though we might reach the different conclusion, I might learn something from you. Even if 90% of what you say I think is wrong, maybe 10% of what you say is right. And so what I will always try and do is to read articles which express skepticism about ESG, despite my career entirely having been about ESG. I like to know what my blind spots are.
It sounds like, in some ways, academia is harsher than investment banking at times.
Well, it is, and I think why. Sorry, because in investment banking, if you make bad decisions, then you will lose business and you'll lose money. Whereas with academia, given people have tenure, you can publish papers with incorrect statements, and there's no consequences of that.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a backlash, but at the same time, there's a lot of businesses who are embracing a different mode of thinking around profit maximization. Do you have examples that you can think of businesses, prominent businesses recently, who have made a shift in their mindset, and that has led to outcomes that they otherwise wouldn't have received or achieved?
Yeah, so you say recently, and this is interesting because there's always people's favourite examples, let's say Patagonia or Unilever and so on. So a more recent example would be the UK banking sector. So banks have often been seen as non-purposeful. They're seen to be the cause of the financial crisis, giving loans to people who'd never be able to repay them. sometimes mis-selling insurance policies, let's say payment protection insurance, to a self-employed person who'd never be able to claim from them. And these banks are the ones who I do think are really trying to embrace purpose. So in the pandemic, they noticed the positive role that they could play, for example, by giving emergency loans, by giving payment holidays and so on. And also they recognise the business case for some of these socially responsible actions. So while I said that the evidence for diversity in the boardroom is much more mixed than what I think, well, there's other aspects of diversity. So let's say as a bank, I might have a policy or strategy to lend more to minority entrepreneurs. And so why might there be a great business case for that? It might be for an entrepreneur in particular, you don't have a financial track record, so how a bank chooses to lend to you might be based on meeting the entrepreneur and seeing whether he or she has what it takes. So maybe confidence will matters, maybe they look a particular way, then this will lead to the human loan officers who are obviously imperfect people with biases making some negative decisions about certain entrepreneurs. So if you explicitly say, well, actually our purpose might be to increase female entrepreneurship or minority entrepreneurship, yes, on the one hand, one might say, oh, are you doing this because it's woke and it's sort of with the times? But on the other hand, there's a clear business case, right? If you are somebody who is trying to look at underrepresented people, that could be similar to the first football teams which were scouting black players and then more recently Asian players because they were historically under the radar. And so there was a clear business case for that.
Righto. And do you, in other industries, so you got banking, are there other industries where you feel that the link has sort of moved things forward?
Yeah, so I think anything which involves a type of technology, they realise that technology might have many benefits outside sort of the core revenue generating field. So one less recent example is Vodafone when in 2007 they launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya. So why did they choose to do that? Well, their expertise was a technology that allowed them to transfer text messages, and then they end up using this to then allow people to transfer money to each other without a bank account. More recently, you had Mercedes, which makes Formula One engines, and in the pandemic, they redeployed their engineering expertise instead to make some ventilators and mass produce them at scale. And why I like those examples is often when people think about CSR, so you asked me earlier what's the difference between pie economics and CSR. CSR is often unrelated to the core business. So we talked about a tobacco company could donate loads of money to a lung cancer charity, for example. Whereas when you think about pie economics, how do you grow the pie? How do you have the biggest impact on wider society? It's by using the expertise that you already have. So when Mercedes made those ventilators, that didn't reduce its carbon footprint. That didn't contribute to diversity and inclusion boxes. But that did create a huge amount of value for society. It saved a lot of people's lives through making ventilators. And they chose to do this because that used the expertise they already had. And then that's also useful because I mentioned one distinguishing feature about pie economics compared to stakeholder capitalism is that you also need to take shareholders into account. But if you're using the expertise that you already have, this doesn't cost you that much in terms of profits. Well, if I give $1 million to charity, that costs me $1 million. But if I use engineering expertise that I already have, maybe I can create $1 million of value, and it might cost me $10,000 of those engineers' time when they were probably sitting idle anyway because there wasn't much Formula One during the pandemic. So I think we should think about how much value we can create. Well, the one phrase I often ask is, what is in my hand? So what that means is, what is the unique resources, what is the unique expertise that I have as a company, and what social problems can I solve using what's in my hand, rather than the reactive approach, saying, well, what is the big issue in the media today, and how can I react to that to show that I'm with the times?
A lot of listeners on this call will be business owners or, in management within businesses. How do you have any, I guess, tips on how to move their businesses forward in terms of thinking about embracing, a purpose-led mindset and growing the pie rather than, the traditional approach?
Yes, I think it's to first think about, well, what is the purpose of your business to begin with? And so what do I mean by purpose? Well, this is why a company exists. This is your reason for being, why you would be there, even if you didn't have to think about profit. So there's like a person's purpose might be to be a doctor because you care about patient well-being, even not taking into account the fact that doctors should be well paid. You could be an investment banker, and that could be really purposeful if you believe your goal is for clients to come to you with their biggest problems and they trust you to give them the advice which is best for them, even if it's not going to give you a fee. So I think these things should be truly purposeful, but the purpose is helping patient well-being or being a trusted advisor to clients, not to make money. And similarly for a company, your purpose could be to make toys that entertain and educate children. And if you do that, you'll be profitable. And notice purposes needn't be lofty. But I chose that toy example because you might think, well, you can be a purposeful company if you're curing cancer or if you're investing in carbon capture technology. But for something like children's toys, that could be something which could be really, really purposeful. And the important thing about purpose, it should be focused. So what might focus involve is that we realise we can't solve every single one of the world's problems, but our goal is to use what's in our hand to serve society. So again, for a tech company, it might be using the technology in ways in which are beyond its core business. For a toy company, it might be there's ways of making your toys more addictive, which lead to greater financial profits down the line, but that's not necessarily in the child's well-being. Might there be other things that we can put in, which maybe parents will not immediately know about? And so this might not actually affect their purchasing decision, but if it's something which actually leads to long-term education or is a hidden feature that only comes out later, then in the long term, you'll develop more customer trust that way. So rather than thinking about, well, will we only do this because there's a monetizable benefit to this? Is this in the interest of my purpose, where the purpose is child welfare? And I think about my own purpose is the creation and dissemination of knowledge. So do I think, when you gave me this invitation, I was like to have it, but don't I think, oh, how much would an hour of my time cost? Well, that hour of my time, I could do some consulting for another company and earn X. Now, maybe when I give this talk, maybe some people end up buying my book and then asking me for some consulting, but that is never anything which is due to my instrumental calculation. But if my purpose is the creation and dissemination of knowledge, I revel and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to spread the message to people in another country or around the world. And maybe it leads to some financial benefits down the line, maybe it doesn't. But for me, it's the purpose that drives the decision. So when I got the invitation, I didn't do any calculation. I didn't think about it. I replied saying, yes, I'd be delighted to be on the show. And I think that would be the same for a company, a business owner, is to think about, okay, yes, if there's a decision which we can do analysis, use that analysis. But for many decisions, is it consistent with the purpose? And I think this is a way of deciding what decisions to take and which ones not to take. And importantly, by having a focused purpose, then that will be something where many decisions which are not in tune with the purpose, you can then turn down. One of the biggest challenges of a small business owner is we can't do everything. Similarly for me, as a person with limited time, if I was to get an invitation to give a talk at Harvard University next week, that would be really prestigious, but that's not connected to my purpose, which is all about practitioners and affecting the way the world invests and does business. So that's why I would say an easy no to that invitation.
It's such a joy, Alex, to hear how you answer questions in such a clear, concise manner. I don't know if it's the academic background or your just deep knowledge of the research that you do, but if I could succinctly describe some of the things I do in the way that you do, I think I'd be a really successful communicator. But that last comment you made, I think I just took for a number of things that we work on within our organization that we could really think about and how to improve things. So, yeah. That was an awesome summary from a really interesting conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alex. I'm conscious that you also have an evening to get on with. It's late where you are, so it was fantastic having you on the call. Fantastic insights for us to share and to think about. And I wish you all the best for the next while. I look forward to seeing what you work on next.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Thank you, James. Really enjoyed the conversation.
This has been the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds KiwiSaver scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, the NZ Funds Advised Portfolio Service, the NZ Funds Wealth Builder, and NZ Funds are income generator. A product disclosure statement for each is available at nzfunds.co.nz. Past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future returns.